He didn't lock her in a storage room or handcuff her to a pipe. He put her in the east wing of his Kentucky compound, gave her a 4-poster bed, a writing desk positioned to catch the morning light, and a door that only locked from the outside. Callum Thorne believed confinement would break her. He'd done it before, brought compromised contractors into his orbit until the uncertainty wore them down, until they talked or confessed or disappeared quietly. People cracked when they had too much time and not enough control. It was simple math. What Thorne had failed to calculate was Sadie Pruitt. By the end of the first morning, she had emptied every drawer in the desk, organized the contents by function, and begun a handwritten inventory of what the room's bookshelf contained. By afternoon, she had flagged a discrepancy in the budget spreadsheet on the laptop left for her. The one with read-only access that she absolutely should not have been able to partially override. Using a secondary admin credential she'd located inside the system's own documentation folder. Thorne found that out when his financial manager called, confused and alarmed, to report that someone inside the secure network had requested red access expansion on 6 folders marked Distribution Logists Krunken. He stood in the doorway of the east wing. Sadie was seated at the writing desk, shoes off, dark hair pinned back with a pencil. The laptop's glow made her look pale and precise. She didn't stand up when he entered. She didn't flinch. "You left me a device with local network access," she said without looking up. "That wasn't an accident from someone who runs an operation your size. You gave it to me on purpose. So either you want me to find something or you want to see what I look for first." She turned in the chair. "Which is it?" Thorne considered her. He'd pulled her out of the Colton Street warehouse fire 48 hours ago, dragged her through smoke and raining sparks, shoved her into the back of his car while his men exchanged gunfire with whoever had started the blaze. She'd been working late, alone, auditing the books for a freight logistics company that ran distribution routes for 2/3 of his incoming product. She'd seen too much. She knew too much. And the people who'd lit the building on fire had targeted the floor she worked on specifically, which meant someone knew what she'd found. He'd brought her here to contain the variable. He had not brought her here to be interrogated. "The laptop is for your use," he said flatly, "not for accessing my operational files." "I didn't access them. I requested access. There's a difference." Sadie set the pencil down. She had dark circles under her eyes and a small burn mark on her left forearm from the fire, wrapped neatly in gauze she'd found in the bathroom cabinet. "The difference is that I was asking permission instead of taking. That's more courtesy than whoever tried to kill me last night showed." Silence stretched through the room. He had expected fear. He dealt in fear, the specific, useful kind that kept his people in line and his rivals cautious. Sadie Pruitt looked at him the way she'd probably looked at every underfunded city agency and dismissive bank manager she'd ever dealt with. Like he was a problem she hadn't decided whether to solve yet. "What did you find in the Colton Street files?" Thorne asked. "Double billing on the port intake records." She turned back to the laptop. "Someone's been billing your distribution partners for container transfers that never happened. Small amounts. Consistent. Going back 14 months. 14 months, his jaw tightened. "Who?" "I don't know yet. The authorization codes were rotated every 6 weeks. But the bank routing on the ghost transfers goes through a holding company registered in Delaware." She tapped the screen. "If you give me access to your internal payroll records and the last 18 months of port clearance logs, I can have a name for you by tomorrow morning." The absolute audacity of it, being held in a man's compound against her will and offering him a timeline, settled in the room like smoke. Thorne walked over and pulled the second chair to the desk. He sat down. He studied the numbers on the screen, the neat red circles she'd drawn around anomalies, in the margins of a printed ledger she'd found somewhere in the desk drawer. "Why would you help me?" he asked. Sadie looked at him sideways. "Because someone tried to burn me alive in a building, Mr. Thorne. And whoever did it works for you or for someone trying to take what's yours. Either way, The fastest way out of this room is to hand you a name. It was a rational answer, a clean answer. It told him nothing about what she actually felt, which he suspected was more complicated than clean. He gave her the access. She had a name by 11 the following night. Levin, Deputy Director of Port Operations, 9 years inside Thorne's organization. Thorne had attended the man's daughter's graduation the previous spring. Sadie walked him through the evidence at the writing desk, the two of them sitting close because the laptop screen was small and the data was dense. She pointed out the routing codes, the time-stamped patterns, the anomaly she'd almost missed. A secondary ledger buried in a maintenance file labeled HVAC schedules that contained 3 years of payments to a numbered account in the Cayman Islands. Thorne leaned forward to read. His shoulder brushed hers. He went still. The room felt smaller than it had 20 minutes ago. "Levin has been feeding your shipment manifests to a competing outfit," Sadie said, her voice carefully level. "They've been intercepting about 12% of your incoming product. That's why your eastern routes have been running short." Thorne didn't respond immediately. She could feel the tension in him from 6 inches away, the careful, mechanical way he was processing betrayal, filing it, locking it behind the cold exterior that she suspected he'd spent a very long time building. "How long have you done this?" he asked quietly. Not a threat, a genuine question. "Done what?" "Looked at numbers and seen what people were hiding." Sadie was quiet for a moment. "Since I was 15. I grew up in the foster system. 7 placements in 9 years. You learn fast that adults cook the books, county disbursement funds that disappeared, grocery budgets that somehow never covered actual groceries." She shrugged, one shoulder. "Numbers don't lie. People who handle numbers do." Thorne looked at her then. Not the way he'd been looking at her since the fire, like a problem to be managed, like something else. He stood up abruptly, taking the cold, professional distance with him. "I'll handle Levin," he said. "Thorne." He stopped at the door. "Don't go tonight." He turned his head slightly. "You haven't slept. You're making decisions on 4 hours and adrenaline. That's when men in your position make mistakes." He didn't answer. He walked out and locked the door. But later, lying in the dark, Sadie heard his footsteps in the hallway, not the measured, controlled stride he used during the day. Slower, heavier. The walk of a man carrying more than his frame was built to hold. She stared at the ceiling for a long time before she slept. He didn't come back for 2 days. The compound went quieter, then louder, then quiet again, in the way that buildings do when something has gone wrong and everyone is pretending otherwise. The man who brought her meals, a compact, watchful enforcer who introduced himself only as Boone, arrived on schedule but made less eye contact than before. The patrol outside her window tightened. Sadie worked. She'd been given expanded access the morning after the Levin conversation, and she used it methodically, pulling apart 3 years of operational finance like she was removing stitches from a wound. She found 4 more leaks, smaller ones. She documented them in a notebook she'd commandeered from the desk drawer. She told herself she was doing it for leverage. She had no illusions about what she was. A witness to things she shouldn't have witnessed, held by a man who made problems disappear. She was useful right now. Useful people lived longer than useless ones. She told herself that was the only reason she noted, on the 3rd night, that Thorne's light was still on at 2 in the morning. She could see it from her window, yellow behind a curtain in the wing opposite hers. She told herself she wasn't worried about him. On the 4th night, the rain came in hard off the hills, drumming against the compound roof. Sadie was at the desk when she heard it, a sound that didn't fit the house, not a footstep, a drag. Something heavy and uneven on the hardwood in the hallway outside. Then silence. Then 3 knocks, soft and deliberate, not the sharp rap Boone used. 3 knocks and then nothing. Sadie walked to the door and pressed her palm flat against the wood. "Thorne?" A pause, then low and ragged, "Yeah." "Can you unlock the door?" Another pause, longer. She heard him shift against the wood, the particular sound of someone leaning their full weight on a door because standing on their own was no longer a reliable option. The lock clicked. The door swung open, and Thorne came with it, catching himself against the frame. He was soaked through, his dark jacket plastered to his chest, and there was a spreading stain along his left side that the rain hadn't diluted enough to disguise. He looked at her. His face was the color of old chalk. "Levin had a partner," he said. "I didn't account for the partner." Sadie didn't scream. She didn't ask why he'd come to her room instead of the medical staff who had to exist somewhere in a compound this size. She understood immediately, with the pragmatic clarity she'd learned in underfunded group homes and indifferent county offices. He'd come to her because she was the only person left in this building he knew hadn't put the knife in. "Get inside," she said. She got him to the bathroom. It took most of her shoulder and 15 agonizing minutes. He left a dark, smeared trail on the hardwood that she filed away to deal with later. The wound was high on his left side, below the rib, a bullet that had passed through rather than lodged, which was the only good news she had. She found a trauma kit under the sink and went to work with hands that shook visibly and steadied by force of will. "This is going to be bad," she told him. "I've had worse." "I believe you." She opened the antiseptic. "That doesn't make this better." When she poured it, Thorne's entire body seized, one hand clamping down on her forearm with a grip that left bruises she'd find the next morning. He didn't make a sound, just breathed, short and controlled, while she talked him through it. Low, steady words, nothing important, just sound to anchor him in the room instead of the pain. She sutured the wound with a curved needle and medical thread. She was not a nurse. She'd never done this before. She did it anyway, because the alternative was watching him bleed out on her bathroom floor, and that was not something her brain was willing to process as acceptable. "Why did you come here?" she asked quietly, midway through the third stitch. Thorne's eyes found hers, pale, sweating, but direct. "Because if I was going to be in a bad way," he said, "I wanted someone nearby who'd be annoyed about it, not afraid." Sadie's hands paused. Something moved through her chest, uncomfortable and very specific. "That's a low bar," she said, and continued suturing. When she finished, she dressed the wound and helped him to the bed. He was too heavy to carry, but too stubborn to fully lean on her, which made the transit slow and graceless. When he finally sat on the edge of the mattress, the performance of invincibility was entirely gone. "The door," he said. "It's unlocked if you want to go." "I know." She walked out of the bathroom, through the bedroom. She stood in the open doorway and looked down the dim hallway. The stairs, the exit, the outside world, all of it clear and unguarded. She stood there for a long time. Then she reached out, closed the door, and engaged the lock from the inside. When she came back, Thorne was watching her with an expression she had no prepared category for. Whatever seal he kept on himself had dissolved. In its place was something unguarded and almost unbearable to look at directly. "The rain," Sadie said, sitting down in the chair nearest the bed, "and I don't know the gate codes." "You're a terrible liar." "Good night, Thorne." The fever broke just before 5 in the morning. Sadie hadn't slept. She sat at the writing desks until dawn with the compound's operational files open on the laptop, and when Thorne opened his eyes, she already had a phone in her hand and a handwritten list in front of her. "Levin's partner is a man named Reyes," she said before he could ask. "Mid-level logistics division, hired 16 months ago. He ran the intercept operations on the ground. Levin was the authorization. Reyes was the execution." She set the phone on the nightstand within his reach. "Boone is the most vetted person on your current roster based on the tenure records I pulled. You should call him before you try to do anything physical. You're not doing anything physical for at least a week." Thorne stared at her. "You've been busy," he said finally. One of us had to be. He made the call, and she listened to the conversation with her back deliberately turned, giving him what privacy the situation allowed. When he put the phone down, she turned around. "Boone's bringing in a crew," Thorne said. The compound is locked down. Reyes won't make it to noon. Sadie nodded. She walked over and checked the bandage at his side. The bleeding had stopped. The wound was ugly but clean. "You're going to have another scar," she said. "I have room." She'd seen the room briefly in the bathroom, the map of old violence on his torso, pale and puckered lines that told a history nobody would write down. She hadn't stared. She'd worked. "Thorne." She sat on the edge of the desk, arms crossed. "Whoever built Levin's network knew your security rotation, knew which contractors were soft, which routes were exposed. Someone senior was feeding information even before Levin turned." She paused. "Your internal accounting has 3 people with full ledger access. Levin is one. The other 2 are a woman named Taft and a man named Osorio." Thorne looked at her steadily. "Osorio has been authorizing overtime for crew members who don't appear on any other personnel record," Sadie continued. "Ghost employees. I flagged the anomaly 3 weeks ago and sent the report to Levin." She let the implication land. Levin buried it, which means Osorio probably knows Levin is gone by now. The quiet that followed was very specific. "How long have you known about Osorio?" Thorne asked. "Since 2 this morning." "And you're telling me now?" "I'm telling you in front of Boone when he arrives. I wanted a witness." A pause. "No offense." Something in Thorne's expression shifted. Not quite a smile. Something older and more complicated than a smile. "None taken," he said. Boone arrived with 4 men, and the clip deficiency of someone who'd managed too many crises to be rattled by one more. He stopped when he saw Sadie in the East Wing, sitting across from Thorne, with a laptop and a handwritten ledger between them. "You look terrible, boss," Boone said. "I've been told," Thorne replied. "Boone, run everything past her today." Boone's eyes moved to Sadie. He was a large man, careful, with the particular stillness of someone who was dangerous and knew it. He assessed her in one sweep and apparently found the result surprising, because his second look was slower. "She's a bookkeeper," Boone said. She identified 3 compromised people from inside a locked room with read-only network access. Thorne didn't elaborate. Past her. Boone looked at Sadie. Sadie looked back. "Osorio will try to move his ghost payroll funds in the next 6 hours, she said, sliding a handwritten page across the desk. "Those are the 3 routing accounts he uses. If you freeze them before he can, he'll either run, which tells you everything, or he'll try the backup account, which I've already flagged to your financial manager." She paused. "The backup account is registered in his mother's name. It's probably the one thing he didn't expect anyone to find." Boone picked up the page. He read it. He looked at her again, and this time the assessment had moved to something that bordered on respect. "I'll get it done," he said. When Boone left, the room settled back into quiet. Outside, the morning had cleared, the hills beyond the compound windows going gold in the early sun. Sadie closed the laptop and leaned back. The exhaustion had been building for days and had finally reached a pitch she couldn't outwork. Thorne watched her from the bed. His color was better. His eyes were clear. "You can go," he said quietly. "When Boone has Osorio, this is finished. I'll have a driver take you wherever you want. There's money, enough to relocate, to not have to think about any of this again." Sadie was quiet for a long moment. She looked at her hands, at the faint rust-colored stain she hadn't entirely scrubbed from under her thumbnail. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "What I want," Thorne said carefully, "is to have met you in a situation where I didn't owe you my life inside of 72 hours. Sadie looked at him. He was watching her with the same unguarded expression from the bathroom, the one he couldn't entirely put back on its shelf. "My apartment burned down in the warehouse fire," she said. "Total loss. I had about $200 in my checking account and a lease with a no-relocation clause." She tilted her head slightly. "You also have a ghost payroll problem and a financial audit 3 months out that, without me, your current staff is absolutely going to fail. That's a practical argument. I'm a practical person. Is that the only reason you'd stay?" The question landed in the specific way questions do when they're not asking what they appear to be asking. Sadie stood up. She walked to the window. The compound grounds below were quiet, the morning patrol moving at the perimeter with less urgency than the night before. "I grew up in houses that weren't mine," she said, to the glass and the hills beyond it. 7 of them. "And the thing about houses that aren't yours is that you get very good at understanding how they actually work, where the money goes, who decides what the real rules are underneath the ones they post on the wall." She paused. "I've been doing that in every job I've ever worked, reading the actual structure under the one they show you." She turned around. "I read yours in about 40 hours, she said, "and I didn't find a machine that runs on cruelty. I found a structure with serious internal vulnerabilities and an accountant who left 14 months ago and was never properly replaced." She held his gaze. "That's a solvable problem." Thorne was very still. "You're not afraid of what I am," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm afraid of a lot of things," Sadie said. "I'm afraid of fire. I'm afraid of spending my whole life being invisible and not noticing until it's too late." She held his gaze. "I am not afraid of you." He looked at her for a long, unmoving moment. "The audit," he said finally. "Q3 reports are in 11 weeks. I'll need full ledger access and a dedicated workstation, not the guest wing setup." Done. And a salary. An actual salary documented, not an envelope passed through a third party. The corner of his mouth moved. It was the closest thing to a smile she'd seen on him. "You're negotiating while I'm in bed with a hole in my side." "You said practical." He exhaled slowly. Some of the weight he'd been carrying, she could see it happening, like a physical thing, shifted. "Sadie," he said, and the use of her first name rather than her surname landed differently than she'd expected. Quieter, more deliberate. She sat back down in the chair. She opened the laptop. They stayed there as the morning came fully into the room, the spreadsheets open between them, the notebook covered in her handwriting. Outside, Boone's men were quietly dismantling what remained of the betrayal that had almost killed both of them. The compound felt different than it had 4 days ago, less like a holding cell, and more like a place where someone was actually doing the work of keeping the foundation sound. Thorne slept again around 10, his breathing evening out while she ran the Q3 projections on the eastern distribution routes. She didn't stop working when he did. She was used to keeping her own hours. By afternoon, Boone knocked on the east wing door to report that Osorio's accounts were frozen and the man himself contained. He stood in the threshold with his arms crossed and that same measured look he'd been giving her all morning. "You want to know what he said when we found the backup account?" Boone asked. "Not especially," Sadie said. "What matters is what's in it." Boone put a number in front of her on a slip of paper. Sadie looked at it, wrote something underneath, and slid it back. "That's what was skimmed over 14 months, she said. "I want it triple-checked before it goes in the recovery ledger." Boone looked at the numbers. Then he looked at her with the slow, particular nod of a man recalibrating. "You do this long?" he asked. "All my life," Sadie said, "just not for anyone who noticed before." 2 weeks later, the east wing was empty. Sadie worked from a ground-floor office, 2 monitors, direct network access. A door she left open during the day because she'd developed a strong and specific opinion about closed doors. She wore her own clothes. She drank bad coffee from a machine in the hallway and complained about it to anyone who walked past, which turned out to be an effective way to get people talking to her. Thorne came to her office the day his stitches came out. He leaned in the doorframe. He did that often, she'd noticed, stood in doorways rather than committing fully to rooms, and watched her work for a few minutes before she acknowledged him. "Q3 numbers will hold," she said, without looking up. "Barely. You've been running soft on the Eastern contracts for too long. We need to renegotiate the Clarkson terms before the next cycle." "I know." "You knew and didn't do anything about it." "I know that, too." She looked up. He was watching her with the expression that appeared when there was no performance to maintain. Open in a way she suspected very few people had ever seen, and fewer still had recognized for what it was. "There's a meeting next week," he said, "with the Clarkson people. I'd like you in the room." "As what?" "As the person who tells them what the numbers actually say." A pause. "As whatever you want to be called." Sadie held his gaze. She thought about 7 houses that weren't hers, about fire and smoke and a locked door she'd chosen to close herself from the inside, with full knowledge of what she was choosing. She thought about a notebook full of observations no one had ever asked for, and the first man who'd looked at what she saw and waited for the real answer instead of the polished one. "Chief Financial Officer is the correct title," she said. "If we're doing this properly, we're doing this properly, then I'll need a substantial raise. You haven't been paid yet." "I know, it's going to be a very large raise." Something in Thorne's expression settled, not into ease exactly, but into something adjacent to it. The look of a man learning, possibly for the first time, what it felt like to have someone in his corner who was there because they'd chosen it. "Fine," he said. Sadie turned back to her screens. "Close the door when you leave," she said. "I have the Clarkson projections to finish." Thorne pushed off the doorframe. He turned to go, then stopped. "Sadie." "What?" "Thank you." He said it the way people say things they mean but haven't had much practice saying, plainly, without ornamentation, like a fact he was reporting rather than a sentiment he was performing. She didn't look up from the screen. "Thank me when the audit passes," she said. "Now go away, I'm working." She heard him leave. She heard down the hall the particular quality of his footsteps. Steadier now, unhurried, a man no longer holding up a collapsing structure on his own. Sadie Pruitt had spent her whole life in rooms that weren't hers. She'd learned to read every one of them. Where the money went, who held the real power, what would fall apart without someone quietly keeping it together. This room, she thought, pulling up the Clarkson file, she'd stay in a while.